better start at the beginning. Well, it's a real pleasure to be back in New Mexico, and after 4 years away, I've realized how important, or how great it was here when we were all together, learning together, coming up through grad school. The cohort I was with was fantastic, and I realized how important it is to have a great advisor like Jim to set you off on the right track. So today I'm going to talk about work that grew out of my dissertation that I've been working on in the past 4 or 5 years since then, and I'm looking at extinction biology as a macroecologist turning paleoecologist. And this is my study area. It's a little far removed from the desert Southwest, but it suits macroecology just fine. So I'll introduce this with something that you're all aware of, that we are facing a biodiversity crisis. We've heard this mentioned in talks earlier today, that a large proportion of at least vertebrates and other taxa are threatened with extinction. And so time may be running out for a lot of biodiversity, and this is something that we as conservation professionals should be concerned about. However, traditionally, many conservation studies have focused mainly on understanding a single species' plight, what has been threatening it and what can we do to restore its habitat or take away the factors that have been leading to its demise. On the other hand, we know from macroecology, again, going back to this great reference, that extinctions can be predictable, and there are things that a lot of endangered species and extinct species have in common. So if we want to try and use a macroecological approach to conservation, we need to understand why are some species more likely to be threatened with extinction than others. And there have been a number of recent papers that have dealt with all of these issues in great detail in the past decade or so. So papers have been dealing with basically looking at 3 different categories of factors that can cause selectivity and extinction. First, external threats. It's really obvious to consider that direct hunting by people or killing by introduced predators, diseases, or habitat loss can cause a species to go extinct. However, a new, recently emerging area of research has been the study of the intrinsic susceptibility of species to some of these external threats. So perhaps body size or being endemic to an area, in case of birds being flightless, or the trophic yield of a species can also be important in determining how they'll respond to external threats that are applied. And then there are also, all of these interactions are taking place within an environmental context, and the area of the island or continent or area that they live in, its isolation and its climate can also play an important role. So I don't have time to review this extensive literature, but people have been starting to use a macroecological approach to understand this selectivity. And so that's what I'd like to focus on today. So with a macroecological approach, what we do is we use a large database, basically as much data as we can get our hands on species, traits, and their distributions. And we want to understand correlations between the extinction or extinction risk and the intrinsic ecology of the species. So this figure just gives you a taste of what this research can be about. On the y-axis we have the reproductive output in terms of grams per year of mammal species of the globe. All the mammal species that have good life history data assembled. And on the x-axis is the body mass of those species. So you can see in classic macroecology style, you have a negative relationship between production and body size. Well, this is not the point of this figure. What I'm showing here today is to take it a step further and start to look at extinction risk within the context of this productivity relationship. And what you can see by looking at the right-hand panel, red shows critically endangered species, orange endangered species, green are vulnerable, and blue and gray are near threatened and least concerned species. What you can see in this panel is that the critically endangered and endangered species tend to have lower productivities compared to the rest of the mammal fauna. So perhaps life history and productivity can be really important in understanding why certain species react very differently to an external threat than some of their relatives. So that was basically the macroecology approach to all of this. And what I want to focus in on today is my special study system that I devote myself to, which is avian extinction on Pacific Islands. And what I'm showing here with this map is basically the spread of human colonization of the Southwest Pacific Islands. So around 3,500 years ago, humanity began a great seaward journey out of the near Oceania into remote Oceania. And you can see by the other arrows that they basically colonized all inhabitable land within the past, up to the past 1,000 years. And a wave of extinctions in the local vertebrate fauna has followed humans on their journey. And here are just a few examples of the bird life that has been lost and known only from fossil remains. Whoops. So here's an overview basically summarizing how good the fossil record is of this extinction event across Pacific Islands. Now, this is data that I've collected from both my own fieldwork and many published accounts of fossil sites. So you can see that many areas have an excellent fossil record, meaning that over 90% of living species have also been recovered as fossils. Similarly, the green circles show islands that have a good fossil record, which means over 75% of living species have been recovered. So that means about 75% of whatever was alive at human colonization has been has shown up in the fossil record and has been recorded, and we know about it. So my data set at this point includes about 45 different islands across the Pacific. It includes over 300 species of birds. And so it represents a pretty sizable macroecology data set. I think I can feel pretty comfortable with that. So first I want to drill down and talk to you about the extinction in the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands are well known for both amazing adaptive radiations in multiple taxa and their very high levels of endemism as one of the most isolated island groups in the world. But as the story goes, as soon as humans colonized that group of islands, we saw a large number of bird species that went extinct. So with this, I'm showing you the number of species on the y-axis and the body mass of those species on the x-axis. And you can see that the original avifauna across the 5 main Hawaiian Islands had a right-skewed body size distribution, even though a lot of these species had arisen through in situ evolution on the islands. They evolved this pattern de novo, as it would be. And what you can see is that the black bars show the species that went extinct at human colonization. And then that was followed up by a few more centuries of human impact. And within the past 200 years, these species in the hatched bars have gone extinct. So what we're left with today are just in the gray bars. Really, it's just a shadow of the former avifauna. And what you can see here is that these extinctions don't appear to be random with respect to body size. In fact, all of the largest birds went extinct prehistorically. And historic extinctions tended to focus more on these medium-sized species over here. So it leads to some interesting questions. So I followed that work up with a modeling project which involves building regression trees. Now I don't have time to go into what they exactly do, but basically it's a classification algorithm which tries to find the best way of classifying each species based on the traits that we input into the system. So you can see that taking both prehistoric and historic extinctions, this model can account for almost half of the deviation in terms of which species went extinct and which ones survived. And this is based on factors such as body mass, where the larger species over to the right were at higher risk, and the smaller species had about 22% extinction. And then if you follow the larger species down, you can see flightless ones were more likely to go extinct. In fact, all the flightless species died. So you can see that there's some context dependency, and there's a lot of focus placed on intrinsic traits of the species, like body size, like flightability, and endemism. So this piqued my interest in looking across all of these Pacific islands to see what kind of pattern can we glean from this recent and severe extinction event. So one of the things that we first have to capture here is to understand how complete the fossil record is and how many populations and species actually went extinct at human colonization. So what I'm showing at the top figure is basically a histogram that's an output of a Bayesian hierarchical mark recapture model. So basically, we're using a mark recapture model to model fossil discovery. So if it was marked, that means it was existing, it lived on the island, and being recaptured means that you actually found a fossil of it. So what we're doing is estimating the number of species that were there that may not have been observed by the fossil collectors. In the same way that you may want to estimate the size of a population when you know that your sampling of that population is incomplete. So at European arrival, across the Pacific Islands, about 200, 220 years ago, there were 799 populations of birds on the islands that we're studying here. But according to the mark recapture model, there were probably 1,454 populations that were present on the islands before human colonization. So that gives us an estimate of the number of populations that have gone extinct. And so just looking at this another way, you can see the frequency histogram for extinction rate then estimates about 48% of all the populations of birds across the Pacific Islands are now extinct. So that is a very large wave of extinction. Now, in addition to changing the entire biota of those islands, we also see interesting patterns in terms of the scaling of body size with island area and the entire body size distributions of birds on those islands. So on the y-axis, I'm showing island area of the islands that I have information for. On the x are the body masses of the birds. So for each island, you can see a row of points which represents their body size distribution. And the red dots are the ones that are extinct. So you can see beforehand, there was this really interesting constraint on maximum body size on each island, where larger islands here tended to have larger species. But you can see that that constraint has shrunk a lot as the larger bodied species have gone extinct. And when we do a more sophisticated sort of classification tree called a random forest, looking at all extinctions across these islands for the past 3,500 years, basically the entire human history of those islands, we see that intrinsic traits of the species explain a lot of the variation in which species went extinct. So body size and geographic range size are the most important factors. And when we actually use the same model to predict extinction risk in the living species of these islands, what we see is a pretty good correlation with their current day red list status, so that critically endangered species are also predicted by our model to be at high risk, whereas least concerned species are also predicted by our model to be at low risk. So our model actually recapitulates what good conservation scientists have been saying about those species. And of interest are these species represented by the red points. So my model predicts that they are at high risk of extinction. However, they are currently listed as a low threat status. So I think that those species require some more study in the field to determine whether they should be uplisted in the future. So to come back around, I think that using a macroscope to study extinction biology is very valuable. We can understand gradients in extinction severity across both islands and in continental settings. We can understand that there is a correspondence between modern and ancient extinctions, in which ancient extinctions can actually be used as a model for present-day conservation questions. And it really highlights the importance of intrinsic traits and metabolic ecology in determining extinction risk. So I feel as though the macroecological approach can provide a bridge not only between conservation and ecology, but also between paleontology and these other fields that links studies across both taxa, space, and time. And thank you very much for inviting me.